There's something almost mythical about Grandma's kitchen, a place where scraps turned into feasts and simple ingredients tasted like love. Every sizzling pan and wooden spoon held a secret, every recipe a survival skill wrapped in comfort. Back then, nothing was wasted, and everything had purpose. But here's the truth, Grandma wasn't just cooking. She was engineering miracles with whatever she had. These weren't just recipes, they were life hacks before life hacks existed, whispered wisdom passed down through generations and hidden in the margins of old flour-stained cookbooks. Today, we're cracking open that cookbook again to uncover 25 forgotten cooking tricks from Grandma's kitchen. Clever, timeless, and guaranteed to make you fall in love with cooking all over again. The bacon grease tin. If Grandma's kitchen had a crown jewel, it wasn't the stove or the spacious oven. It was a humble, slightly greasy tin or coffee can that lived on the back burner. After frying a batch of morning bacon, she would carefully pour the still liquid fat into this tin, sometimes straining it through cheesecloth to keep out the burnt bits. It would cool into a creamy, white paste. Then, throughout the week, that fat became her secret weapon. A spoonful melted into a cast-iron skillet to fry eggs for our lunch. A generous scoop started a pot of pinto beans, giving them a deep, porky richness that simmered for hours. So, looking for a bit more flavor, here you go. Mock apple pie. I remember the first time I saw Grandma do it. I was perched on a kitchen stool, legs swinging, watching her crush a sleeve of crackers into a bowl. "Are we making a snack, Grandma?" I asked. She winked. "No, honey. We're making magic." And magic it was, for she was about to perform the greatest trick I'd ever seen, baking an apple pie without even a single apple. And here's how to recreate Grandma's greatest magic trick. Layer those buttery cracker crumbs with a syrup made from sugar, water, and a lot of cream of tartar and lemon juice to mimic the tartness of a green apple. She'd top it with a lattice crust, and into the oven it went. Do all of this, and what you'll get is a sweet-smelling pie that tasted like the real deal, the Oatmeal Stretch. No one understood resourcefulness like Grandma, and she had this neat trick that made sure the meatloaf, patties, or meatballs were enough to fill more bellies. One day, I saw her pour a cup of rolled oats right into her ground beef. I was quite shocked too, but that's just how this trick goes. This was her way of making a single pound of ground beef feed a family that seemed to multiply around her table. The oats, or sometimes stale breadcrumbs softened in milk, acted as a filler, but in the best possible way. They made the meatloaf miraculously moist and gave the meatballs a lighter, more delicate texture. The best part? We never felt cheated. So you can take this page out of Grandma's cookbook and economics textbook. The baking soda milk rescue. Growing up, I knew baking soda was for baking, but sometimes I'd see Grandma do something strange. She'd open the milk bottle, give it a cautious sniff, and then grab the box and shake a tiny, almost invisible cloud of baking powder into the milk. What was she doing? Well, rescuing the milk, of course. Milk, as it begins to spoil, becomes more acidic. The baking soda, being a base, would neutralize that acidity just enough to stave off sourness for another day or so. With the popularity of refrigerators, you'd almost have no need for this trick. But if you ever have a little milk sitch, this trick can allow you to use that last cup for a batch of pancakes or to stir into a morning coffee without the fear of a sour taste. Coffee cake soak-up. There was a specific quiet ritual reserved for mornings after we'd had cake for dessert. Grandma would take the leftover slice, perhaps a slightly dry piece of pound cake or a corner of chocolate sheet cake, and place it into a shallow floral-rimmed bowl. Then she'd pour hot, strong black coffee right over the top. To my young eyes, it looked like she was ruining a perfect piece of cake. But then she'd hand me a fork, and my world would change. This was simplicity itself. The cake, usually a day old, would act like a sponge, greedily soaking up the hot coffee. It was a dessert and a warm beverage all in one, often eaten in the quiet of the early morning before the rest of the house was awake. Taming the onions bite. I loved helping Grandma make her famous potato salad, but I always dreaded the onions. We always had this little problem of the onions being a bit too sharp. Well, that was before she realized a little trick that dared defy logic. Instead of adding the pungent, sharp-looking pile directly to the bowl, she'd sweep them into a separate basin of cold water and sprinkle in a generous pinch of salt. This quick brine worked wonders. The salt water would draw out the onion's harsh, sulfurous compounds, taming their aggressive bite. This goes perfectly into a potato salad, adding crunch and flavor without overwhelming the delicate potatoes and creamy dressing. Boil cake batter. Some of my favorite cakes didn't start with a mixer whirring, but with a saucepan bubbling. Grandma would call it a boiled cake. Well, you can call it an alternative to constantly tossing your cake batter in the oven. This method, often used for Texas sheet cake or certain chocolate spice cakes, was brilliant. By boiling the wet ingredients first, you're melting the sugar and blooming the cocoa, creating an intensely deep flavor base. Once you take it off the heat, quickly stir in the flour and eggs. The best part of this trick is that there's no creaming of butter and sugar, No alternating dry and wet ingredients. This is a one-pot wonder that would always result in a cake with a uniquely moist, tight crumb and a faintly fudgy texture. Potato Pancake Resurrection. The day after our Thanksgiving dinner, the refrigerator was always packed with leftovers. And the big question was always, what do we do with all these leftovers? Grandma looked into the refrigerator and saw a challenge. Her eyes would land on the half-empty bowl of mashed potatoes and a smile would appear. Have you heard about the potato pancake resurrection? She'd take those cold, leftover mashed potatoes and mix in a handful of flour and a beaten egg. She'd form the mixture into small patties. Then, into a hot, lightly greased skillet they went. She'd press them down with the spatula, and we'd watch as the edges turned a deep, golden brown. Serve this with applesauce or a generous spoonful of sour cream, and voila! You've perfectly freed up some space in your refrigerator. No need to thank Grandma. The Vinegar Buttermilk Quick Fix. Grandma's pancake breakfasts were legendary, and they always started the same way. But one Saturday, I saw a whole different recipe. That day, we were completely out of buttermilk. My heart sank, fearing the pancakes were canceled. But Grandma just shrugged and reached for the vinegar bottle. This is quite the pancake hack. She'd measure out a cup of regular milk, then pour in 1 tablespoon of plain white vinegar. She'd stir it and set it on the counter for a few minutes. And sure enough, within 5 minutes, the milk would look slightly curdled and thick. It wasn't true cultured buttermilk, but the acid in this faux buttermilk performed the same crucial chemical reaction with the baking soda in the pancake recipe. The result was pancakes that were just as tall, fluffy, and tender as ever. So, if you don't have the right ingredients, improvise. Balanced canned tomato sauce. Grandma's spaghetti sauce simmered for hours, a rich red concoction that filled the whole house with a delicious aroma. But one day, I noticed her do something that confused my sugar-loving heart. After tasting a spoonful from the big pot, she frowned slightly, then opened a box of sugar cubes and dropped a single, perfect white cube into the swirling Red Sea. Why did she do this? Well, to give it a little grandma touch. You see, canned tomato products often carry a sharp metallic acidity. Sugar balances the acidity. It was the difference between a sauce that tasted like it came from a can and a sauce that tasted like it came from Nona's kitchen. So, ask yourself, how do you want your sauce to taste? The Damp Towel Bread Revival. There was a specific kind of disappointment associated with a loaf of bread that had gone stale. But Grandma never accepted this fate. She'd take the loaf, run a clean dish towel under the faucet, wring it out until it was just damp, wrap the bread in it like a swaddled baby, and toss it into the oven. Yeah, this definitely sounds like a hoax, but the science behind it should fix that. The gentle, moist heat from the towel and the warm oven would work miracles. As the oven warmed to about 150 degrees Celsius, the steam from the towel would rehydrate the starch molecules in the bread, softening the crust and restoring a soft, springy texture to the crumb. In just 10 to 15 minutes, what was once destined for the bin was transformed back into a warm loaf, ready for slicing and slathering with butter. The cereal crumb breading? The end of a cereal box was always a sad moment for younger me, but the opposite in Grandma's kitchen. Instead of tipping the last dusty bits and broken flakes into the trash, she'd carefully pour them into a plastic bag. The chickens will love this, she'd say, and for years I believed her. Cornflakes work best for this trick. Their mild flavor and fantastic crunch are perfect. Now, mix the finely crushed flakes with a little salt, pepper, and maybe some paprika, then press them onto chicken pieces or pork chops. Baked in the oven, they create a shatteringly crisp, delicious crust that even you kids will adore. It's more than a great treat. It's an embodiment of Grandma's most frugal of principles, waste nothing. The eggshell in the coffee. Grandma's percolator was a noisy, bubbling beast that announced the start of every day. And while it warmed up for another coffee-filled morning, she had this one peculiar habit. After cracking eggs for breakfast, she would carefully rinse the shells under the tap, crush them gently in her palm, and toss them right in with the coffee grounds. You see, the calcium in the eggshells binds with the tannins and acids in the coffee grounds that contribute to bitterness. The result was a brew that was noticeably smoother, less harsh on the stomach, and with a cleaner finish. It was a simple, natural fining agent, long before water filters and light roast profiles. And you can still try this trick out today if you want to give your cups of coffee a new taste. Baked potatoes without foil. When Grandma made baked potatoes for a crowd, she'd line them up on the counter like little soldiers. I'd wait for her to tear off sheets of aluminum foil, ready to wrap them up. But she never did. Instead, she'd take each potato, rub it all over with a little oil and a sprinkle of salt, and place it directly on the oven rack. Baking a potato directly on the rack allows the intense, dry heat of the oven to circulate all around it. This created a thick, leathery, gloriously chewy, and flavorful skin, the best part of the potato, according to Grandma. The foil method, she insisted, steamed the potato in its own moisture, resulting in a soggy skin and a denser, wetter interior. The mystery soup bag. The freezer in Grandma's basement was a cavern of wonders, but the most intriguing thing was this frost-encrusted gallon bag that lived in there. Throughout the week, I'd see her add to it the snapped ends of green beans, the top of an onion, carrot peels, celery leaves, and the picked clean carcass of a Sunday roast chicken. It was a bag of what I thought was garbage, and I couldn't understand why she was saving it. Well, until now. This is what she called her soup bag, her personal stockpile of flavor. When the bag was full, its destiny was fulfilled. She'd dump the frozen block of scraps into her largest stockpot, cover it with water, add a bay leaf and some peppercorns, and let it all simmer for hours. It was a broth that cost nothing, but was worth everything. Doesn't sound like much now, but trust me, in a world that always values the new and perfect, some imperfection still goes a long way. The paper bag popcorn. Long before the era of microwave popcorn, a movie night at Grandma's was heralded by the appearance of a humble brown paper lunch bag. It was a sight that promised fun. She'd let me pour a half cup of popcorn kernels into the bottom, then she'd add a glug of vegetable oil and a sprinkle of salt. And this bag went straight into the oven. The hot enclosed air of the oven would heat the oil and kernels until the pressure was too much, and the popping would begin. The bag would puff up like a pillow. When the popping slowed to a few seconds between bursts, she'd pull it out, carefully, with oven mitts, and we'd tear it open to release a cloud of steam and the irresistible smell of perfectly popped, lightly oiled corn. Easy peasy. The fork pastry cutter. When I was younger, Grandma and we kids would dedicate an entire day to making pies. Flour filled the air like snow in December, and the kitchen table was dedicated to the sacred act of crust making. Grandma had a drawer full of gadgets, but for this most important task, she always reached for the same tool, a simple, four-tined dinner fork. With this trick, you can say goodbye to using fancy gadgets for pie cutting, and all you have to do is use the fork tines to cut cold butter into flour for pie crust or biscuits. So, whenever you can't find the dedicated tool, try Grandma's makeshift tool. Pickle eggs in pickle juice. You're probably wondering, what are eggs finding in pickle juice? Well, give it a minute, would you? The day the last pickle was fished from the jar was always a little sad, but in Grandma's kitchen, it wasn't the end. You know that briny dill-infused juice? Yeah, she'd take it and toss in a batch of peeled, hard-boiled eggs. The jar would go back into the fridge, and we'd wait, oftentimes impatiently. After a few days, the magic of osmosis would do its work. The vinegar and spices from the pickle brine would penetrate the eggs, turning the white a faint yellowish green and infusing the entire egg with a tangy, salty dilly flavor. They were the best snack growing up, a protein-packed, zero-waste treat that was both weird and utterly delicious. Add egg to soup. Sometimes a pot of chicken noodle soup looked a little thin. Maybe the chicken was sparse, or there were more hungry mouths than expected. Grandma would peer into the pot, give it a thoughtful stir, and then crack an egg into a small bowl and whisk it briskly with a fork. As the thin strands of egg hit the hot liquid, they cooked instantly, solidifying into delicate, silky ribbons that swirled through the soup. This simple addition, a technique with roots in Asian and Italian cooking, transformed the bowl entirely. It was a 5-second fix that turned a light soup into a satisfying meal. The grated butter biscuit secret. The key to Grandma's legendary flaky biscuits was always cold, cold, cold. She'd keep her butter in the freezer until the last possible second. She'd pull out her box grater and grate the frozen butter directly into the flour. It looked like a shower of buttery snow. This method was genius. The tiny shredded pieces of butter distributed themselves evenly throughout the flour with minimal handling, which is the secret to a tender biscuit. When the biscuits baked, those hundreds of little butter flakes would melt, releasing steam and pushing the layers of dough apart. The result? Well, a biscuit so tall, so light, and so impossibly flaky, it would practically shatter when you pulled it open. It was a professional-level technique achieved with the most basic of tools. Keep your casserole cozy. With newspaper, preparing for a church potluck or a trip to a sick neighbor was always quite something growing up. A casserole would be baked, bubbling, and perfect. But then, instead of a fancy insulated carrier, Grandma would reach for a stack of yesterday's newspapers. She'd swaddle the hot Pyrex dish in layer upon layer of newsprint, tucking and folding like she was wrapping the most precious of gifts. This wasn't some quirky tradition. Believe it or not, but it was remarkably effective physics. The trapped air between the many layers of paper acted as a superb insulator, holding the heat of the casserole close. Ever struggled figuring out what the perfect housewarming gift would be? Well, here's your answer and a little trick to keep it hot, too. The brown sugar softener. The brown sugar was always a lot of trouble, more than any of us knew how to deal with. One week it would be soft and scoopable. The next, it had transformed into an impenetrable, rock-hard lump. But Grandma always knew what to do. She'd simply open the bread box, pull out a slice of soft white bread, and tuck it right into the canister. "We'll have that fixed by tomorrow," she'd say with unshakable confidence. And sure enough, she was always right. The bread, being much more moist than the hardened sugar, would act as a humidity source. The sugar would draw the moisture from the bread, slowly softening over 24 to 48 hours. With this trick, you can always bring your brown sugar back from the brink. Degrease with an ice cube. A hearty beef stew or a pot of chicken soup was a winter staple, but sometimes it would come out with a layer of unappealing fat floating on top. Grandma never liked this, none of us did. The problem is that skimming it off with a spoon was a slow, tedious process. Luckily enough, there's an alternative, the ice cube alternative. We'd take a single ice cube, wrap it in a thin piece of cheesecloth or a clean rag, and tie it at the top. Then, like a master painter, she'd skim this little bundle across the surface of the stew. With a few passes, you can easily remove almost all of the surface grease, leaving behind a cleaner, purer, and more flavorful broth. It was quick, efficient, and felt like pure kitchen sorcery. The stew stayed hot, and the job was done in seconds. Revived limp lettuce. A head of lettuce that had been forgotten would emerge looking sad and wilted, its leaves limp and lifeless. In any other home, it might have been doomed, but not in Grandma's. She'd fill the sink with cold water, add a handful of ice cubes, and a good squeeze of lemon juice, and submerge the entire sorry-looking head. The ice-cold water shock would cause the cells in the lettuce leaves to plump back up with water, restoring their crispness. The lemon juice in the water helped to maintain the bright green color, preventing it from turning brown. After a 10 to 15-minute bath, that lettuce would be miraculously revived, crisp, vibrant, and ready for a salad. It was like giving the lettuce a jolt of life. The string cake slice. Cutting the first slice of a beautifully frosted layer cake was always a moment of high drama. A knife, no matter how sharp, could crush the delicate crumb and drag frosting everywhere. But Grandma had a secret weapon she kept in a kitchen drawer, right next to the measuring tapes, a spool of plain, unflavored dental floss. She'd hold the ends of the floss, pull it taut, and gently lower it onto the cake where she wanted to slice. With a smooth sawing motion, she'd pull the floss through the entire cake. The thin, strong string would glide through the soft crumb and any nuts or chocolate chips without any resistance, creating a perfectly clean, crumb-free cut. She'd then slide the slice onto a plate, its edges pristine. It was the professional baker's trick she used to make every slice look perfect. These tricks were the threads that wove the fabric of Grandma's kitchen. While our kitchens may now be filled with gadgets she never dreamed of, the soul of her cooking, the resourcefulness, the joy, the deep-seated belief in making something from nothing is a legacy that deserves to be passed down. So, tell us, how many of these are you familiar with? How many would you like to try out? If you learned something new today, hit that like and subscribe button. And until next time, my green-thumbed friends.